Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where I will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships and how to overcome them so that you can move through your pain and get to the kind of healthy relationships you want, need, and deserve. I'm Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based in California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational and informational, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Also, due to the nature of the podcast, some of the information presented on the show can be sensitive to some of my listeners, so please note that listener discretion is advised. I'd like to say that for this episode in particular, we will be discussing some sensitive content. More on that in just a minute, but of course, as you know, I like to go over the housekeeping stuff first. So if you have any questions, comments, or you need to email me about an episode, or you have some episode suggestions that you would like to hear about, please email me at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com. And if you want to if you want more education and more tips and suggestions on narcissism and narcissistic abuse, please be sure to go to drnataliejones.com and sign up to be a part of my weekly newsletter where I email out weekly tips and education to my subscribers. And currently there's now a free ebook download if you sign up on how to determine on whether or not you are indeed a toxic person or you have some toxic stuff that you need to work on. So please be sure and download that. And after many, many requests, I have decided to open up group and individual membership coaching for folks. So that is currently in the works, and I'm currently working on opening that up, hopefully by the end of this month. Click in the show notes down at the link to be the first to be in the know when that launches, so you could be the first, hopefully, to sign up to work with me. All right, so getting back to the groove, I hope everybody's doing okay and that you're staying safe out there. I'm in California, so COVID has taken on many variants. We currently have the Delta, Mu, some other stuff that they're talking about is coming on the way from India and all that kind of stuff. So it's crazy times that we're in. So please make sure that you're staying safe, wearing your mask, washing your hands, all that kind of good stuff. Today's episode, I am talking with Miss Jordan Pickell. She is a psychotherapist based out of Canada, and she and I are going to have an interesting conversation about vulnerability and sexual violence. So that's why I put the extra caveat on listener discretion and viewer discretion today. Because that is such a sensitive and triggering topic, and we try to be sensitive to that in the podcast. So just FYI there. And, I really enjoyed my time with Jordan on this podcast. This has been one of my favorites. And, I think I always say that I'm biased. They're all my favorites, but I really, really like this one. This episode holds a special place in my heart. So be sure to take off your shoes and relax for a while Jordan and I have this conversation. Hello and welcome to the show, Jordan. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm glad that, we can connect again. As we were talking about a little bit ago, we've been Insta pals for a hot little minute now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's nice to virtually connect. So we're like one step closer.
Yeah, it's totally different, right? We're both human versus, some of our quotes online.
Absolutely. Right. There's a person behind all of the hard content that we create, the awesome, hard-earned content, all that stuff. There's an actual person. So I'm giving my listeners a chance to meet you.
That's great. Yeah. Nice to meet everybody.
All right. So for my listeners who may not know who you are, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and the passion behind your work?
Absolutely. Yeah. I am a therapist in Vancouver, Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I work with people around healing from trauma. So trauma from early experiences or family of origin, abusive relationships. For a long time, I did work around sexualized violence, which is still a big part of my work around childhood sexual abuse and sexual assault in adulthood. Some of my main pieces, I would say, that I work around now are around building authentic and mutually satisfying relationships. So relationships where we honor our wants and our needs and the differences, the wholeness between people. And though I work mostly with individuals, I also work with couples and family members and sometimes friendships as well. And along with, the relationship work comes setting boundaries, both in creating those authentic relationships, but also, the healing and from trauma work, whether it's with toxic people, abusive people. I'm thinking about your listeners and being able to, get separation from those folks and to reclaim their own space, their own wholeness. And then along with that, self-compassion, right? Of setting boundaries, and that it's really hard to do, the guilt and the shame around what they've experienced, the way that they're coping, where they are in their healing journey, like wanting to be further along than they are. And then I think another core piece of my work is the anti-oppression piece. So being able to just name some of the larger systems and the cultural messages that people get, whether depending on social location and culture, because that can feed into so much about our social scripts of relationships and what's okay and what's not okay, and the ways of being that are okay, and where we derive our self-worth, being able to combat some of those things. So that's kind of the lay of the land for my work.
Yeah, we definitely have a lot in common. And as you're talking, the one thing I was thinking about was, wow, I probably need to have you on for more than one show, because I didn't realize you do the sexual violence aspect of it also. So a lot of some of this, a lot of the stuff that you kind of talked about, we also share a lot of commonalities, which makes sense. That's why we're Instagram.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I definitely kind of want to talk to you a lot about sexual violence, because I do think, and that wasn't the plan for the show today, but
I'm happy to go where you want to go.
Tell me a little bit, before we get into the nitty gritty, tell me a little bit about what sort of got you interested in all this.
Well, it usually comes from our own experiences, right? And so I think that my own experiences drew me to this work in my family in particular, and being able to, then I got into, really coming into the feminist anti-oppressive work, which drew me to women's organizations. And so much of those organizations are working from violence from men towards women. So that's where I really got started in working with anti-violence work. And then from there, just getting my expertise around sexualized violence and abuse.
Very good. And I also can relate to that as well. And again, in the experience in terms of, again, family of origin or community of origin, as well as working with, doing a lot of community work with violence against women and things like that. So again, I feel like we're kindred spirits there.
Yeah.
Recently, and I think I'm going to try and see what I can squeeze in this interview. So, because I want to get as much out of you as I can. But, recently you started, on your, one of your recent posts on Instagram, you talked about vulnerability. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is? Because there are a lot of people out there that struggle with it. But also, I feel like it's one of those words, it's like one word, but it has a huge meaning.
Absolutely. Well, when we're just looking at the dictionary definition, right? It's the openness to being hurt. And I think the way that we use it now around vulnerability is around emotional pain, emotional hurt, and being able to unearth or open up to, especially when we've been hurt in past relationships, whether it's with family of origin or in abusive relationships or toxic relationships with difficult people, that we close ourselves off, or even just living in the culture that we live in, we close ourselves off from sharing certain parts of ourselves. Again, depending on the family that you grew up in, the culture you grew up in, there are certain ways of being, certain emotions that are acceptable and unacceptable. So for some people, it's sadness. I think, about when we're just talking about, let's say, gender, that sometimes that we're allowed to be more soft. And I don't know, when we're talking about Black women, there's the difference, right, of being able to, the softness maybe being different of what's acceptable and expected. Again, depending on your upbringing and your culture and the way you present. But yeah, so in vulnerability, it's when we are vulnerable, when we show those parts of ourselves with people that are more tender, are more, it feels like we could be easily hurt. It's a risk. It's a risk because we need people. And sometimes with those pieces, when we show those pieces of ourselves, we could be rejected. Maybe we've been rejected from those pieces in our past. And so we don't want to, we hold back from sharing those parts of ourselves. And then when we do, when we take that risk with people who have kind of earned the trust or some level of trust, and we're met with care and understanding and openness and respect, then we can feel closer and we can feel more whole as people, that they see us in our wholeness, in our, broader sense of who we are, our emotions. For some people, what's vulnerable is gender or sexual orientation identity. For some people, it's certain emotions, certain more intimate parts of our life experiences, that sharing those things, then having those things cared for and believed and valued by someone, we feel closer.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree with the way you broke it down. And I thought that the way you explained it was very eloquent. And I do think, again, so much goes into like cultural nuances, gender nuances, family stuff. And you're right, even within certain cultures, there's this certain stiffness or this desire to be strong or not let people see you be weak or have emotion, so that you can be there for everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How can someone go from that to being vulnerable? Because a lot of times people struggle with that. They don't like it, so how can one go from being super strong to being open and vulnerable?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I would say that in some ways it's earned. It depends on, we get to choose who we're vulnerable with. We get to choose the moments where we're vulnerable and having that intention. So if you're listening and wanting that, it's something that is how we are more likely to do it if we're choosing to. And I would say that to be vulnerable is, it's the right moment, it's the right person, and wanting to be closer to someone. To me, in my mind, and I will write about this at some point, but in my mind, vulnerability is, it's courage and it's trust. And so the courage piece is something that we get to choose, but the trust piece is something that's built between the two people. So that I think, is more of this fluid thing that happens between two people, and that it can be difficult. If you have difficulty trusting, it's going to be, I think, harder to choose to be vulnerable. Or if you do with the wrong people, there's more risk of being hurt.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I would also even go so far as to say, if you still have, toxic family members or toxic community in your life, that's also going to be a problem, because, those things that we become very habit forming for us, or become a way of life for us. It's very hard to do it consistently in one area and then stop doing it in another area.
Exactly. Yeah, there are people, when you start to value the idea of vulnerability, when you start to have this intention of, I'm going to be more open about my thoughts, my feelings, and my needs, but it does depend on who it is. And there will be more certain relationships where we're going to choose to be vulnerable, and certain relationships where it's actually harmful to be vulnerable. And that when you're trying to be vulnerable with people who are toxic or abusive, that it's, then it becomes your openness to be hurt, which is the definition of vulnerability, whether it becomes a point of debate, or there's a rejection or a dismissiveness or a minimization of or humiliation from being vulnerable. And so we have to be very careful in choosing who we trust, and the right moments and the right people to be vulnerable with.
I agree, because I do think that it can be weaponized against you with the wrong person.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit more about that. How to find someone that you can trust, or how to determine who you can trust, particularly, with the folks that you and I work with. They have a history of being abused. And so, in my experience, people that have a history of being abused, they don't trust themselves to make the right judgments.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, I would say, one of the impacts of trauma, of abuse, right? Is not knowing who to trust, not being able to understand or be connected with your own intuition. What is the difference between intuition and a trauma response, right? Is, okay, maybe I'm drawn to people who are going to be humiliating or to minimize, or maybe because of my traumatic experiences, I am going to be very skeptical and feel to big red signs of danger, danger, danger in my brain, even if maybe that they're a safe person. And so that stops us from being vulnerable, which, when, in my work, I tell people to just have, again, so much self-compassion around the lack of trust, because it's completely understandable, that people are trying to protect themselves. And maybe that's the place where they are at in their healing journey, is that we don't trust anyone, and that's okay.
What is the difference between intuition and trauma response?
Whew. Yeah. When we haven't experienced trauma, or we're at some level of healing, we can follow that gut sense of, when they call it gut sense, it really is. It's like our vagus nerve. We can feel it, of this person. I feel safe with them or unsafe with them. And it isn't a cognitive experience. It's a visceral experience of
Mm.
intuition. And if you've experienced trauma, it comes from, the amygdala, the part of your brain that signals danger, danger, danger. It is what the brain recalibrates to do when you've experienced that danger. And so it's kind of a fight or flight experience. And so that's what I would say. If we can be discerning, which in the beginning, it's very difficult to be discerning between intuition and trauma response, and that it can become so muddled. And again, that's okay. But I would say that there's a difference between that gut sense and the fight or flight sense.
Absolutely. I would agree
Yeah.
with you there. And I would even take it, you know, and I don't know if you agree with this, but I would also say, in my experience, there's a certain sense of familiarity with a gut experience. You can't necessarily put your finger on it, but you can sort of detect the danger. There's something about this person, or there's something about the situation that seems familiar, and it just doesn't sit right with you. Whereas a trauma response, I think, like what you were saying about the sort of fight or flight, it's just more like, you might have been triggered and you got to get out of
Mhm.
there, or you just,
Yeah.
whatever the case may be, but you don't necessarily have that almost like that deja vu, or this is a
Mhm.
familiar sense to me.
Mhm. Right. I love that way of putting it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's a knowing. It's an inner
Yeah,
knowing.
it's an inner knowing. Yeah, I
Mhm.
like that. I like the way
Mhm.
you put that. There's an inner
Mhm.
knowing there about a person or a situation that you maybe can't name, or even you can name it. And it's just like,
Mhm.
this is kind of,
Mhm.
it reminds me of, this or that. So thank you for, exploring that rabbit hole with me.
Mhm. Oh yeah, I'm open to going to this. That's my favorite thing to do, to go down the rabbit holes.
Mine too, right? I want to take a bit of a segue, if you don't
Mhm.
mind, into the sexual violence,
Mhm. Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
because it's great to have you on here and have you kind of break that down for us. Can you talk a little bit about what sexual violence is?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, some of sexual violence, there's what happens in our what we think of sexual violence, right? Which is that um it's maybe sexual assault, it's rape in an alley by
Mm,
a stranger.
yes.
Um and it's about desire, but in actuality, sexualized violence is it's about power.
Mm,
And we kind of, yeah, we sexualize it based on kind of cultural ideas. Maybe it's parts of um the parts of the body that it includes, um but that, yeah, I mean, it's another form of physical trauma. And to me, when I'm doing the work with sexual violence survivors, that it's not about the details of what happened,
mm,
even though that can feed into the specifics of someone's triggers.
mm,
That really, it's very similar to other forms of trauma, right? And in finding healing through tracing the impacts of it on your relationship with yourself, your relationship with the way you see other people, the way you see the world, and what a good world is, or having that shattered, um, that sense of self, feeling hollow,
mm,
feeling like you're kind of a walking dead person,
mm,
feeling disconnected from the human community.
mm,
And then there's the specific triggers, right? The specific triggers um, around the content, maybe, of the violence, that are it's going to feed into what your triggers are.
mm.
Oh wait, I have one more thing to say,
Okay.
which is that the idea that it happens by a stranger is very, very uncommon,
Okay.
and that typically sexual violence comes from somebody that you know and trust. So whether it's a partner, somebody that you went on a date with, a friend of a friend,
Mm,
a family member, mom's boyfriend, father, grandfather, stepdad, um, neighbor,
classmates.
classmates. Yes. So people that you know that have access. So that's part of what's so confusing, I think, for a lot of the people that I work with, where it's someone that I trusted. How can they how can it be that they did this to me? It must not be violence. It must be some kind of confusion, right? And then there's the cultural messages around sexualized violence
Okay.
where it's normalized. It's so ubiquitous that it's kind of, people don't see it as a big deal. They might see it as a bad date, quote unquote, or that maybe you're confused and that's not really, it wasn't really violence. It was just, yeah, it was just a bad date. Maybe there was a miscommunication, when in reality, there is a sense of power over, and that it's, again, not about sex typically, that it's about asserting power over another person and not seeing them as a whole human being.
Wow. And I couldn't agree with you more that a lot of times it is from people that we know or that we have some sort of relationship or familiarity with. But, I do think strangers can also play a part in it. But I also think that there's one of the things that I've run into, and I don't know if you've run into this too, is that um, people don't know exactly what actions may constitute sexualized
Right.
violence,
Mhm.
meaning that, there's some confusion over
Mhm.
whether, if something happens once, okay, then it must have been a runoff. It must have been just like just a strange situation that happened. If something happens because someone is under the influence, then
Mhm.
that must be the cause of that situation.
Right.
And so oftentimes there's a lot of dismissals around what constitutes sexual violence, the variables
Mhm.
that may actually impact that. And then there's this sort of dismissiveness or feeling like I've overreacted or I should let it go.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I've come across that. I think that, when we talk about, first of all, the variety of experiences, I know you say this at the beginning of each episode, but it is, take care of yourself. And when we're having this conversation,
Oh,
the
yes,
listeners,
definitely.
that
Definitely.
if you need to, I'm going to maybe say some details of some things that I've heard. So
Mhm.
go ahead and skip ahead if you
Thank you.
want, but just that it's not always, you know, penetrative, that it can be about just violation around touch. It can be, um, sometimes it's not even around even touching someone. Like if we're talking about childhood sexual abuse, it can be showing a child pornography,
Yes.
can be a form of it, right? Of bringing sexualized content to a child is sexual abuse.
Mm,
And I think that's something that people don't really understand. And, when you talk about drinking, for example,
yeah.
let's say both of us were drinking, it can't be sexual abuse. Then often I say, well, if for the purposes of therapy, if someone tells me that they've been violated, that's where I go to, of
Mhm.
that, you know, regardless of whether the court would think it's sexual abuse, because if we're looking at how many sexual assaults
Yes.
or just rape in general become prosecuted, it is a very, very small, because that's the way
Absolutely.
that our legal system is built, and
Yes.
our cultural ideas about what sexual assault is. So I don't base it off of what could be prosecuted, right? So it's what is traumatic, and we're going to go there. And
Mm,
then the ideas around, like, let's say these quote unquote gray areas, as a collective, at a cultural level, we are not there to have these conversations about the more gray areas, because it's used those variables are used to discredit survivors, right? It's not about grappling with consent and what violence really is, and instead it's about minimizing, denying, um, again, just dismissing what a survivor is telling. And there's,
mm,
those people typically have a stake in it, right? They know that person. It's uncomfortable for them to grapple with the fact that you've been sexually assaulted by someone in the friend group or someone in the family. And so they are somehow finding a way to say, well, he was drunk, or you were, they thought that you were into it, so that's why that happened. Because they have a stake in you sort of letting it go.
Which is truly narcissistic.
Mm-hmm.
Very narcissistic. And it's unfortunate, but it happens to so many people. And I feel like circling back to the vulnerability piece, that impacts the ability to be vulnerable. When people when they dismiss their experiences, or, a very common one is to not think about it and put it in the back of our mind and just try to move on and get over it.
Yeah.
But I think that when we do that, it continues to come up over and over and over again, and it ends up hurting you. It's almost like the violations continue.
Yeah. And that's part of the deadness that I talk about, right? Is we can honor the self-protection, the survival strategies of closing off, of dissociating, of numbing, of putting in the back of your mind. It makes sense because it is a difficult, especially if you're, I don't know, raising a family, just trying to get food on the table, and it's a big investment. It's very scary to get into the healing process. So I want to honor the self-protection and the survival strategies. And I also feel and I see the complicated nature of what is healing as relationship, right? And when we're in self-protection, we close ourselves off to the exact kind of healing connection that we need to heal.
Yes.
And so it's this trap of how do we escape this? And part of it is building trust with people, finding the right people so that we can be vulnerable, because as we're vulnerable, we can have that healing connection to go, okay, not all people are going to hurt me, that I can be known and seen and loved as I am. And that when we have that mutual connection, that we feel alive again.
Yes. Yes, and I would agree. And I would also say a part of that is, when when you've experienced sexual violence or sexual assault, there's a part of you that loses your voice, whereas vulnerability also gives you the power to use your voice. It's talking about what you need and what you've experienced in just sort of the raw, uncut version. And I think that's kind of, if you look at it in a way, that it can be sort of a corrective emotional experience.
Yes. And so it almost, again, to circle back to where we started around vulnerability, is choosing the right people in the right places. Yes. Because some of the trauma response sometimes is to do the opposite. It's not really to protect and close off and to not talk about it. It's the opposite, to talk about it with everybody. And sometimes that's the first step in people's healing journey. They go from not looking at it to looking at it at all, to opening Pandora's box, saying it in public, saying it on Facebook, and saying, not, you get to determine where you share it. And there's a difference between a grounded vulnerability and kind of spilling, a reliving of the lack of boundaries that, again, does not honor the wholeness, the self-worth, and the mutuality that comes with real vulnerability. It's more of a one-sided thing. I spill to everyone and I don't get much back, because what I'm doing is not about the relating. It's about me getting this out, which, again, sometimes we need. Sometimes it's part of the beginning of the healing journey, and to get to the place of the mutual healing connection, the real vulnerability, that takes a groundedness, a sense of boundaries, of choosing who and when to share these parts.
Yes. I agree. And I appreciate you bringing up the spilling portion, because I think that's a part that not a lot of people talk about. That piece is like where you kind of want to shout it from the rooftops. You want to tell anybody and everybody, or um, maybe you want to be believed,
Yeah.
or maybe you want
Yeah.
some sort of, there's some people, and I know that the way that this might come out might sound bad, but I mean it in a way that, like, it's kind of like people want attentiveness.
Yes.
Like they want the care and they want the concern of other people. And so they want people to know, they want people to react, and they want people
Absolutely.
to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And I hear what you're saying about sometimes we need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I also sometimes worry about, some of the people that I've worked with who've done that, and that becomes a double-edged sword,
Yes.
and it does harm them on the back end.
Mm-hmm.
It adds to the harm in some way, because it's like people don't like to hear bad news.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And not to say that that's the victim's issue, but I hear that, like, a lot of times the way that society works is they don't want to hear victims.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's part of what we were saying around vulnerability, is that it's for the right people. It's an earned trust where we're vulnerable. It's grounded in the sense that, because sometimes when we spill, they'll use that to discredit us when it's the wrong
Yes.
person, right?
Yep.
And then, like you said, it becomes more harmful. And sometimes it's this other thing that I see where people are reliving. So they're telling the story. They come to counseling for the first time. They're telling the story, and there's like this glazed look over their eyes. It's like I'm not even in the room,
Yes.
and that they are just saying the details. And it's almost as if that they are there.
You can do it.
And so again, that is, to me, that's not vulnerability. It's reliving, it's re-traumatizing.
It is.
And so again, I really understand. As a new therapist,
Mm.
I wanted to give people all the space to tell their story, because I know how important it is
Mhm.
for people, especially when you just realize that this is what happened. You
Yeah.
just, said this, I've been hurt, and I validate it in myself. And now I want other people to know and validate it with me. And so they come to therapy for the first time, wanting to tell their story. And as a new therapist, I would give all the space without realizing that for some people, they really are being re-traumatized, that they really are reliving it as if it's happening now.
Yep.
And that they aren't connecting with themselves or with me. And it can be harmful, like you said, on the back
Absolutely.
end. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a common mistake of new therapists. I'm thinking about when I was just starting out eons ago. And I can certainly relate to what you were talking about. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, because you could see it.
Mhm. Yeah.
You could see layers of it. I don't know how to make that any clearer to the listeners, but you can actually see it kind of sort of playing out like a movie, and you could just see this person's whole demeanor change.
Yeah.
And given that most of us anyway, only have 50 minutes, it's not a lot you can do to kind of gather that person and try to make them whole again in 50 minutes, much less if this is something that they've been carrying around for a lifetime.
That's right. Yeah. So then when we're on the receiving end, when we're the listener, whether you're a therapist or just a family member, a friend listening to someone tell you their story,
Yes.
that it's important that we receive them in a way that's, that honors the story, that says, saying, I believe you. I don't actually need to know all the details because I believe, because that's sometimes what happens, right? People are telling the story, maybe not reliving, but they're telling the story as if to say, as if to make their case,
Yeah.
that
Oh,
this
yeah.
is real. This is real. And so
Why
I'm going to
don't
tell
you
you
believe me?
all the
Yes.
details so that you will believe me.
Yes.
And as the listener, I say, I believe you. I believe you. I don't need to know all the dynamics, all the ways in which this played out because I believe you.
Yeah. Some of the work that I've done around that is not necessarily, again, reliving the trauma, like you said, not going into all the finite details, but more or less how that has impacted them and blocked them from achieving um, relationship health, vulnerability, sexual health, and things like that. So if it's impacting their functioning, for example, a lot of um, victims of sexual violation or assault that I've worked with, a lot of times what some of them would do is not shower for a while, or they wouldn't care about how they dress, or they wouldn't take care of themselves. And that can work as a two-part issue. One, to kind of detract people from, prevent people from kind of looking at me or kind of wanting to be engaged with me or wanting to have any sort of relationship with me. And part of it is just because, you know, my body parts of my body have already been taken away from me.
Yeah.
So I don't really, what's the point?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so just sort of talking about those kind of ways in which we can reincorporate love and care
Yeah. Yeah.
back into ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That's sort of taking on, that's a common thing around feeling dirty, feeling damaged, feeling broken,
Mm-hmm.
as if you're an object. So being objectified, my body is no longer mine. My body is no longer, it's been, dirtied in some way. I now take on the shame. I'm disgusting. I'm bad. I did something wrong. It's like taking on the shame and the guilt that the person who did it should
Absolutely.
feel, but instead they're the ones that are feeling guilt and shame, while the other person kind of is unaffected, theoretically. And so reclaiming ourselves, taking care of ourselves.
Yep.
I think that it's a work in progress.
Yes.
It's something that when people come to therapy, they've already started that journey,
Yeah.
right? They're saying, I'm valuable enough that I'm going to do this for me. That I am going to take this time, I'm going to invest in myself. And so that again comes in the form of being able to, be able to care for our bodies.
And take your power back.
Yes. And that is a huge piece, whether it's with your voice, whether it's with the way you dress, the way you carry yourself in the world. It might seem small to other people, but it's huge to that person.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I am, I have power. I get to have my own wants and needs and preferences and to take up space.
And to be seen, because I think there's a part of, when people kind of let themselves go, either physically, or they just check out and they dissociate mentally and psychologically or even sexually. I think there's a part of them, they kind of want to disappear from the world or just not be seen anymore. And this is kind of the way to kind of show up and be seen, because people deserve to be seen again.
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings to mind how people who've experienced sexualized violence sometimes kill themselves, right? Because wanting to disappear, wanting to, you know, just even just the world, right? The world is not a good place. My life is not a good place. And so coming to therapy, you know, being able to show up in the world, take up space, use your voice. These are the ways in which we reclaim. It's again, it's this fluid, it's this circle where it's both a way that we heal and a sign of our healing.
Yeah. Healing comes in stages, and it's trauma is very different, difficult, it's ugly, but it can also be beautiful too, because I think that you can kind of look at it as very black and white, all good or all bad type of thing, or just all bad, and just be very sort of black and white about it. But I think all of us have experienced trauma in some way, right? You've experienced it, I've experienced it, listeners have experienced it. And it can be a good thing in the fact that there are people such as yourself out there doing this kind of work that can help others, right? You can use your experience to help others. And had you not had that experience, can you still do the work? Yeah, to a certain degree. Yeah, you can, but you can't really relate to what people are going through. And I think there is something much more unique about the relational piece. I don't care what anybody says. Oh, you don't have to have the, people get on that bandwagon that you don't have to have people that have gone through this that can help. That's true to a certain degree, but I do think there's an extra layer of just kind of experience it. And then also healing with the folks that we're healing too, right?
Yeah.
Because there is a part of you that also kind of grows and changes as you do the work. So trauma, and I say all that to say is that it's an evolutionary process. You kind of at one point you start out, you might feel victimized and still go through some years feeling that way. And maybe there's a certain part of your life where you kind of go through that every single day, but maybe that feeling lessens and lessens, and you can actually do something with that experience and give yourself a voice. You can talk about it in a way that is uplifting and doesn't necessarily tear you down.
What a gift.
Yeah.
What a gift.
That is such a great gift. And it's a good place to try and get there if you can, and allow yourself the life that you deserve despite all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Despite, right. And like you said, now I get to the place where I love myself. Like people will say, I love myself, and I am not who I am if I didn't experience what I experienced.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And that includes this depth. It's like people who've lost someone someone close to them who have died. I have seen a dimension of humanity, of life, that other people don't have access to. And now I can connect with other people and myself and life in a way that with a depth that maybe some people don't access.
Yeah.
With an attunement to to what is good, because you've seen what is bad.
Absolutely. And I think the destructiveness comes out of the darkness and the secrecy. So when you protect this other person, or when there's a lot of secrecy and shame, that's where things get really destructive and really bad. But then when you're able to kind of come full circle, and you're able to have conversations like this, or you're able to talk to your son or your daughter or your sister or your mom or people about your experiences, and maybe even offer some insight, I think that's the piece that the world deserves to know.
And some people turn it into whole professions, right? They write books. It becomes
Yes.
it can be the source of creativity.
Yes.
And like you said, and connection.
Yes.
That is special.
Absolutely. This has been a great conversation between you and I love it.
I agree. Thank you for having me on, Dr. Jones. This is great.
Thank you for coming. Tell us you know, my listeners, how they can find you if they want to connect with you, or if they're enamored with you and they like what you say and want to see more of your work, how can they find you?
You can find me on Instagram. So it's at Jordan Pickell Counseling. So my last name spelled Pickell. And counseling is also spelled with 2 L's because I'm in Canada. I have a boundaries workshop coming out November 13th. I don't know when this is going to come out, but I'll have another boundaries workshop. And I also have a podcast called Edge of the Couch, and that's for new therapists,
Nice.
where we talk about some of these things about what you face as a new therapist. And some of these more difficult things that you don't really talk about in grad school.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that. And thank you for having that kind of podcast. I wish I had had something like that. Oh, the stories I have about grad school.
Right.
Oof.
Yeah.
Still gives me nightmares. Talk about trauma,
Mhm.
but anyhow. Well, thank you so much for
Yeah.
coming on, and I enjoyed having you.
Yeah, thank you. Me too.
Okay, so you've heard my talk with Jordan. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did. Love to know what your thoughts are on this episode. It's always great to connect with an Instagram buddy. You know, we kind of follow each other and we kind of travel in circles. And it's always great. It's really great for me to connect with someone whose work falls in line with a lot of stuff that I do. And that's why I felt like this podcast really resonated with me. It's because she gets it. And we work with similar clientele who have similar issues. And, training is very, very similar in a lot of areas as well. So I really enjoyed this episode. Plus, Jordan is just fun to talk to. And I would love to have her back on again in the future. Let me know what you guys think, if you really enjoyed having her as much as I did, and what you thought about this episode. And guys, until next time, take care of yourselves and be well.